Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our discussion of the ethics of eating animals. And this module for this week, we're going to turn away from utilitarian style arguments for the claim that factory farming is immoral. Instead, we're going to look at deontological approaches as well as contractarian views that argue for the same conclusion that factory farming is immoral. So in this video, I want to go through some of the more important, basic sort of key moves that different philosophers have taken with regard to deontology and contractarianism, just so that you can see how these views differ from utilitarianism as it relates to animal ethics. I have also included some videos for you to watch that spell out what we mean by deontology and contractarianism in a little more detail, so that way you get a good sense of these sort of normative theories as they might apply to our topic of the ethics of eating animals. Specifically, on Peter Carruthers' paper Against the Moral Standing of Animals. I really like that video. I think it does a really nice job of going through some of the details in Carruthers' view, his contractarian approach. And so I want you to take a look at that. You'll need to do that, pay attention to that video as well for your assignment for this week. But first, before we do anything else, let's just go ahead and remind ourselves of what we discussed regarding utilitarianism last week. Remember that last time in last week's module, we looked at utilitarian approaches to animal ethics, especially how thinkers like John Stuart Mill or Jeremy Bentham or Peter Singer or Norcross. And remember, for them, for these utilitarian philosophers, they argued that what really matters from a moral perspective is sentience, which is essentially the ability to feel pleasure or pain, the ability to suffer in some sense. And this is what defines what it means to have a moral status on this utilitarian approach. Indeed, Bentham famously gives us a nice quote with regard to this, where Bentham says, quote, "The question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer?" End quote. Right. So I think Bentham's way of putting this point does a nice job, a really good job of making it clear that the utilitarian is viewing having a moral status or being a part of the moral community in terms of the ability to feel pain and pleasure, or the ability to suffer, to have this notion of sentience. So now today we're going to build upon that discussion we had last week, and we're going to introduce two other important approaches within normative theories and more general. So for one approach is going to be Kantian Deontology, and the other is going to be Contractarianism. And both of these views, these traditions, take a very different starting point than utilitarianism. Right. So instead of grounding morality in something like pleasure or pain, the ability to have sentience, instead they emphasize rationality, this idea of coming into an agreement with other rational agents or moral agents, we might say. And by the end of the lecture, I hope that you'll see how these frameworks, both utilitarianism as well as deontology and contractarianism, how they differ in their accounts of the moral community, but also how they sometimes arrive at the same conclusion, namely that factory farming is immoral. So let's begin then with just some background about utilitarianism as it relates to this notion of speciesism, because that was a key part of what made for the utilitarian style arguments. Right. So let's just do a quick review of utilitarianism. Remember, for Bentham and someone like John Stuart Mill or Singer, morality is all about maximizing the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people and minimizing suffering. Right. That's a key part here. So what matters is the experience of pain and pleasure, not whether some being can use reason or language or enter into a social contract with other agents. So if a being can suffer, then it's sufficient to count as being a part of the moral community. And since non-human animals, since these entities can suffer, then they will also be a part of the moral community. Indeed, Singer develops this point into a very powerful critique of what he calls speciesism. And remember, we talked about this to some extent in the module last week, where speciesism is the idea that it's a kind of unjustified bias that one might have in favor of members of one's own species simply because they belong to that species. So, in the same sense, then, that racism privileges one race over another, and sexism privileges one sex over another, speciesism privileges humans over non human animals without any kind of moral justification, without giving any sort of moral reason for why we should do so. And from that critique, Singer develops what he calls the principle of equal consideration of interest. And that's important to pay attention to because, Singer thinks that animals have rights. But the way that we should understand what he's saying here with regard to animal rights is in terms of this principle of equal consideration of interest. So, in effect, what this principle says is that having similar interests deserves equal moral weight, no matter who happens to have them. Right? Equality here doesn't mean identity, right? So we're not saying that they should have identical rights, right? So dogs don't have a right to vote, for example, because they have no interest in voting, but they do have an interest in avoiding pain. And that interest deserves the same consideration as a human's interest in avoiding pain. Right. So that's a very radical point. That's a really radical shift insofar as it's challenging us to recognize that the boundary of moral concerns cannot simply be drawn at the edges of our species. Right. What we mean by being a part of the moral community can't be determined merely by species membership. What matters, morally speaking, is whether or not a being, whether it's a human being or a non-human animal, whether that being has particular interests, right? Above all, the interest in avoiding suffering. And so that was a really crucial part of Singer's critique of speciesism and this development of a utilitarian approach to animal ethics. Right. So Singer applies this to factory farming, and the utilitarian verdict is quite clear. Right. It's wrong because it creates massive and unnecessary suffering on a scale that is actually quite difficult to comprehend. And when we looked at Norcross's paper regarding puppies and people and whether or not, it's absurd that Fred, tortures puppies in his basement, if we apply that same point to all of the suffering, the unimaginable amount of real suffering that's happening on these farms, right, with regard to factory farming, well, then it seems very, very clear that this is immoral from a utilitarian perspective. Now, what I want to do is turn to Kantian Deontology, which focuses on having a kind of ability to reason, ability to make choices for yourself, to determine your own course in life based upon the values you have, right? So this idea of reason and rationality is key according to Kantian Deontology, right? So let's turn to this view in a little more detail. Kant's approach, it should be said, is non-consequentialist, which means that morality is not determined by the outcomes of our actions. So essentially, on this view, we're no longer going to be concerned with whether or not our actions are maximizing happiness or suffering, or what the outcomes or consequences are of our actions. It's not that those things don't matter at all. It's just that's not what matters, morally speaking, according to deontology. Rather, it's the reasons and the intentions that we have for our actions, right? So for Kant, an action has genuine moral worth if it's done from the right kind of reasons or having a kind of duty or acting in accordance with what he calls the categorical imperative. And that's because the right thing to do is not for one's own interest or any kind of convenience, right? We're not concerned with the consequences. Rather, we want to make sure that our actions are rational, right? If they're rational, then they will be moral, right? So there's this close connection between morality and rationality, according to Kant. And he calls this approach, he gives it this name of the categorical imperative, which is a kind of principle of ethics on his view. And it comes in two different formulations. There's some dispute about whether or not this is really the same principle or not. But for our purposes, we're just going to grant that these are just two different formulations of the same principle. So let's take a look at the first formulation of the categorical imperative, this principle, right? The first formulation usually is called the formula of universal law. It says, act only on maxims that you could will to be a universal law. In other words, we are supposed to ask whether the principles behind our actions, the reasons for our actions, could be consistently applied to everyone, everywhere, and in such a way that it would be fair, right? We would be, all acting according to the same reasons. So now the second formulation of the categorical imperative, it's similar, but there's some changes, some differences. And it's usually called the formula of humanity. What it says is that we should always treat human beings, whether in ourself or any others, as an end in itself, never as a mere means to an end. Right. So the basic idea is when we act, we should not treat people as mere objects or as a tool to use, right? And this captures Kant's idea that we are all rational beings and that we have intrinsic worth and dignity in virtue of our rationality, in virtue of being rational agents. So, on this view, when we think about the moral community or having a moral status is going to be defined not by sentience, right? Not by the ability to experience pain and pleasure, but instead by rational agency, right? If you're a rational agent, if you have this ability to make rational choices for yourself, then that's your ticket, right? That's what will count for you belonging in the moral community, for being a part of the moral community, right? So to be a person with a full moral status, you must be able to reason and act autonomously and choose principles for yourself. Right, this is going to set the boundary of moral status in a much more narrow way than we saw with utilitarianism. So, what does this say then about non-human animals? Well, notice that for Kant, animals, generally speaking, lack this kind of rational autonomy, insofar as they cannot legislate moral principles for themselves. Right, they're not able to be self-governing in the same way that we are, according to Kant, at least. And so they don't have any kind of a direct moral standing insofar as they're not a part of the moral community, right? And at least not in the same sense that humans do. And at first glance, this might seem to justify our, treating animals as tools. We might think that since they're not a part of the moral community, they don't have any moral status because they're not rational agents, then we can use them. We can treat them as resources to be exploited. But actually, Kant argues otherwise. Kant does not think that's the case, right? He does not agree with the claim that animals are to be used or exploited as objects or tools. Instead, he insists that cruelty to animals is still morally wrong, not because animals in themselves have any kind of moral worth or status, but because of what such cruelty actually does to us as moral agents. Right. So if I habitually treat animals as a mere object, then I risk eroding my own moral character, my own understanding as a moral agent. Right. I'm undermining my capacity to treat other human beings with respect, the respect that they deserve as rational agents. And in this way, then, Kant actually believed that we have indirect duties to non human animals. Whereas we have direct duties to treat other rational agents, like you or other human beings, we have direct duties to treat them as, in a way that respects the rational agency. We have indirect duties to animals insofar as we don't want to become habituated in being cruel to them, because that could lead to being cruel to rational agents. So I think that's a pretty interesting move. That's a pretty interesting way to approach things from a Kantian perspective. Now, there are other approaches, right? Other philosophers have built upon Kant's framework, but then gone on to argue that animals do have some sort of moral worth, right? They have some sort of moral significance insofar as that they are still a subject of a life, we might say, right? They still have desires, they have memories, they have some sort of a sense of the future, and they can still experience things. And so, in that regard, they do have some sort of inherent value and maybe even some rights in the same way that humans do. And I think this is along the same lines as what we see in Singer's approach, even though Singer is thinking about things in terms of utilitarian approach to animal ethics. But on a rights-based approach, on this sort of view, animals should not be treated as mere means to an end, regardless of what the consequences are. Even though that may, be a really good thing for our economy or for, health in general, nonetheless, because they have rights, they have interests, so that means that we should not treat them in this way. So while Kant himself denied that animals have any direct moral status or moral standing in virtue of being a part of the moral community, later on, other deontologists have used these ideas to argue that animals belong in the moral community after all. not because they are able to suffer, right? That's not the key point according to deontology. Rather, it's because they do have intrinsic value insofar as they are still a subject of a life. So now let's turn to contractarianism, which is, again, it's still a version of deontology, right? This framework, contractarianism, shares many of the assumptions that deontology puts forth, namely this idea of being a rational agent. So notice that contractarian theories see morality as a kind of social contract or a social agreement amongst different rational agents, right? So in order to count as a member of the moral community on this view, you must be capable of entering into this kind of social contract. So you're able to make agreements with other rational agents, and importantly, you must also be capable of reciprocity, and insofar as you're recognizing and abiding by different moral rules, the rules that you would all agree upon as rational agents entering into this social contract. So Carruthers develops this idea in the paper Against the Moral Standing of Animals, which you should have read for this module. And as the title suggests, Carruthers argues that animals, technically speaking, do not have any direct moral standing. And that's because they cannot participate in contracts, right? They can't enter into these agreements in the same way that you and I can. So essentially, non-human animals lack the rational capacities that are required for reciprocity, and therefore they fall outside the moral community. However, notice that Carruthers, in a very similar way that we saw with Kant, does not conclude that anything goes when it comes to animals. He doesn't think that we can treat them however we want and use them as mere objects to be exploited. They're not resources in that sense, right? So he argues that cruelty to animals can still be wrong in many cases, even though the wrongness is indirect. So mistreating non-human animals might actually harm other humans insofar as those humans might actually care about those animals. Or it might corrupt one's own character in ways that spill over into how we treat other human beings. So this is right along the lines as what we saw with Kant's view. So Carruthers and Kant share a similar position, right? Animals are not moral agents, technically speaking, but our treatment of them still matters because of its implications for how we treat other human beings. It is also, I think, worth noting that this sort of contractarian view has faced many different challenges and criticisms, which you're going to look at when you take a look at the other video on Carruthers' view of contractarianism. All right, many people have argued that it's going to leave animals too vulnerable in different ways, since their protection depends upon, entirely depends upon human interests. So if we don't really care about protecting them, then not much will happen. And for these sorts of reasons, we can see why someone like Singer, who again is a utilitarian, really demands that we pay attention to the rights that non-human animals have, where we're understanding the notion of rights in terms of this kind of protection of our interests and the same sort of interests that non-human animals have insofar as they want to avoid pain and suffering. Right. So again, that kind of view really is focused on the rights that animals should have because animals do matter for their own sake, not simply for our own sake. So at this point, there's a lot of different views that we've been considering. There's the sort of utilitarian approaches that we saw last week. Now we've introduced Kantian deontology and the kind of views that Kant has considered, as well as contractarian views, which are very similar to the deontological views of Kant, as well as Singer's approach that really attributes having different rights to animals, where these rights are understood in terms of protecting different interests. So what's really striking, I think, is that despite these very different accounts, these very different assumptions where different views begin, all of the approaches still converge on the same basic idea, right? The same basic idea that our current treatment of non-human animals, especially in regards to factory farming, how this is morally indefensible, right? The idea that we're producing so much suffering is something that we should really take serious, right? Utilitarianism condemns it because of the suffering, whereas the deontologist condemns these sort of practices because of the way we are treating animals as mere objects, and then contractarianism might condemn it because of the cruelty that we do to these animals and how that might affect relationships that we have with other human animals, other rational agents. So even though these are very different routes, they still take us to the same conclusion. And I think that's one of the most fascinating aspect of moral philosophy as it relates to this topic of the ethics of eating animals. So even when these foundations diverge, still the practical outcomes we can see are very similarly aligned. And so that's what I want you to pay attention to as you go on to watch the other videos on Kantian Deontology, as well as Contractarianism, and then finally the video on Crother's approach, his Contractarian approach to why factory farming is still morally problematic, even though animals, non-human animals, technically speaking, are outside of the moral community.